Welcome back to Sociology 1 here at Hubert College. Don't worry, nobody's watching. We'll start off today with a special announcement from the Western Farm Workers Association, who requested some time to talk to you. So turn them over to you.
Okay. Thank you. All right. How's everybody doing?
You might want to stand more.
Excellent.
There you go.
Oh.
No, now you're on camera.
Oh, that's okay. I'll just stay
See
here.
you right there.
Okay. So my name's Ingrid, and this is Josh, and we're both volunteers with Western Farm Workers Association. And how many of you have heard of Western Farm Workers? A couple of you. Have you ever volunteered with us?
You're in the back.
Oh, okay. Well, now's the time. How about you? Did you volunteer? Oh, wait. I don't know you.
Yeah, I volunteered.
You volunteered before? Oh, okay. Excellent. What did you do when you volunteered?
I was a part of Key Club, so I volunteered.
You're in Key Club. Oh, awesome. Well, the Key Club at Yuba City High School, they're going to be helping us again with our turkey distribution and family holiday party coming up. In fact, that's part of why I'm here. I hope to encourage all of you to come down and volunteer with us this season. Josh is passing around a couple of flyers. One is for our turkey distribution coming up, and the other is just general information about Western Farm Workers Association. Our phone number and address are at the bottom of all the printouts. But let me start with what is Western Farm Workers Association, how we got started, and why you all might be interested. So Western Farm Workers Association is a labor organization of a new type. We organize low-paid working men and women throughout the area. We do it on a community-wide basis, and people from all walks of life are involved in our effort. So we are Western Farm Workers Association, and many of our members are farm workers, but other low-paid workers in the community, of course, are like people who work in retail, fast food. Anybody here work fast food? Yes, yeah. Retail? No? Yes. What kind of work do you guys do?
Student.
You all work? You all go to school? School? Just school?
Yeah.
Oh, you're fortunate. Okay, most classes I go to, like half of the student population in the class is working in one form or another. So you're fortunate you can focus on your studies. So we got started as a disaster relief effort in 1986 here in Olivehurst and Linda, and we very quickly grew into an effort that operates 365 days a year on an all-volunteer basis. We run a benefit program for members of our association that includes things like food, clothes, legal advice, medical care. We do it on an all-volunteer basis. 100% supported by the community, so we don't take any government funding, and it's members helping other members and people throughout the community coming together to make it all possible. And we do it not just because, people need help sometimes with food and clothes or medical care, legal advice, which are some of the benefits, but we do it because we understand that building strong organization is what it's going to take to turn things around. I'm sure we could all agree that times are tough, more and more so. We're all here. You're at school because you hope to be able to get a degree and do something with that in the future, right? What do you want to do?
I don't know yet.
You don't know. You're trying to figure it out. Okay. Who's got their track set? What are you going to do?
Nursing.
Nursing. Okay. And you want to get into nursing because you just want to make tons of money? No? Because you care for people? Because you want to see people thrive? Okay. Well, so that's a good reason to be a part of our effort. If you have any inkling that there's some problems out there and you want to be a part of changing them, we're a good organization to do that with. We teach organizing skills and at the same time work to meet some of the immediate needs that people have in our community. So you have a couple of our flyers, and one of them I mentioned is the turkey distribution. This time of the year we run a series of events because the holidays are very difficult. It's there's the pressure to buy this time of the year, and we have a program to help offset those expenses. So if you're interested, you can either come to our office, fill out the back of one of those forms, and send it in, or you can leave your name and number with us right now as we pass around the clipboards. Are there any questions? No. Excellent. I tried to make it short.
Okay, no, that's good. And I'm about to explain to them how they can get extra credit by helping you guys out.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I think they're a really interesting organization, especially maybe now. a lot of people have suddenly become more vulnerable in America today, given the political changes, and so organizations that help vulnerable people without power are probably needed more than ever. But as usual in this class, you can get extra credit for doing community service as long as you come and clear with me that you're going to do the community service, and as long as you can document the hours that you do. So if you do any volunteering at all, even if it's just a training day with Western Farm Workers, I'll be happy to give you extra credit for that. And that leads me to the next point I forgot to make the other day. If you're not too happy with your scores on the exam, one or both of them, there is an option to do a research paper in this class. And if you're like me, you might be a better writer and thinker than test taker, memorizer and test taker. And so if you're that way, then maybe a paper would be a good thing for you. But this research paper, it's meant to take the place of your lowest test score. So it's meant to be about the equivalent amount of work as a test would be. And for each of our tests, there's like 4 or 5 weeks of coming to class, there's reading the material, there's studying it and thinking about it. So quite a few hours involved just to get ready for a test. So I'm expecting, a similar number of hours being put into this assignment. So the way it works is, if you want to do this optional research paper, you need to stay after class today, and I will give you your first step of the assignment. And the assignment will involve you going out and doing things and coming back and checking in with me after each first step. The first step is going to be a thinking step. The second step will be going out and interviewing people. And the third step is analyzing the interviews. And after each step, you come and talk to me. So there is quite a bit of work involved, but it can take the place of your lowest test score. And it will not be due until the last day of finals at Yuba College, which isn't until like December 18th or something like that. So if you want to do that, come see me after class today. And extra credit, aside from community service, any on-campus event that you go to, if you go to it, turn in a paper to me describing the event and tying in a concept from this class, and you can get extra credit for that. If there is an event in the community that you think would be intellectually enriching to you, you can come and talk to me about it, and if I approve it, you can get extra credit for that. Or for doing community service, and especially, well, not especially, but one option is Western Farm Workers. All right, any other questions then about all of that? Nope? All right, well, they're still here, but I'm going to go ahead and start lecturing because we're pressed for time. We need to catch up so you can be prepared for your next exam. We're still talking about the research process. And we were talking about logical issues around the research process, and we already talked about tautology, and we started to talk about falsifiability, or really the issue of non-falsifiability is the problem. I don't remember exactly how far we got in this, but the basic idea is that in order for something to be scientific, it has to be measurable. And there are certain kinds of ideas that you can't really define clearly and measure clearly, and if you can't measure them, then science can't disprove them. So falsifiability has to do with something is falsifiable if it's measurable. If you can't measure it, you can't possibly prove it wrong. Now, just because you can measure it doesn't mean you will prove it wrong, but if you state it in a way, your concepts in ways that can't be measured, then a scientist can't possibly disprove it wrong. I don't remember, did we talk about God the other day?
Yeah.
So statements of faith, for example, are not measurable. They're based on faith that something exists without measuring it. So therefore, somebody who's using measurement as their method of proving things isn't going to be able to prove that God doesn't exist because it's not measurable, or that God didn't cause the creation of the universe. Another kind of statement is statements of opinion, subjective opinion. If I say I think pizza is the best thing on earth, you can't prove I didn't feel that way. You could even hook me up to a functional MRI machine. Subjective opinion. Subjective means internal to me. So if I say pizza's best, and you say, well, I hooked you up to an MRI machine that measured your brain waves, and when you ate pizza, it only lit up a little bit, but when you ate ice cream, the MRI machine really lit up. in other words, trying to convince me that objectively I really like ice cream better than pizza, I could still come back and say, well, I don't care what the machine says. I personally think pizza is the best. So in other words, you can't measure somebody's opinion aside from them telling you what it is. So if I can't measure it independently from what you're saying, I can't disprove that you think that. So in that sense, statements like that, really it has to do with values. Science can't decide what's best or not best. Science is kind of value-free. We can measure things. We can measure what caused the universe, whether it was Big Bang or not, but we can't tell you if it's a good thing that the universe exists or if, like global warming. Science can't decide whether it's good or bad that the Earth is heating up, but it can tell us whether human emissions are causing the heating up. So values are more human creations that science can't really decide. And so statements of whether something's valuable or not, or subjectively valued or not, we can't really measure that in science. So those are non-falsifiable. Another kind, though, that's important, another kind of statement that would be unfalsifiable is where the y variable hasn't happened yet. If you say, for example, and Marx's theory, by the way, is like this. Karl Marx says capitalism causes a worldwide revolution, a proletarian revolution. Let's just call it a workers' revolution. And according to Marx, that will happen in the future. Once capitalism polarizes on a grand scale and the whole world is either worker or non-worker, and the workers outnumber the non-workers. And you could say to any Marxist theorist, well, that hasn't happened. We've had capitalism for 300 years and there hasn't been a worldwide workers' revolution yet. So is your theory wrong? Have we falsified your theory, therefore? And a Marxist theorist could say, it just hasn't happened yet. It's in the future. Well, I can't prove a theory is wrong if the thing it says is going to happen is in the future, because you can always say, well, you can't measure the future. It hasn't happened yet. So I can't prove it's not going to happen. And so some people say Marx's theory that capitalism will lead to a workers' revolution is more like a statement of faith than a statement of falsifiable, a verifiable statement. And so if it's not verifiable or it's not falsifiable, then it's not really science. It might be inspiring. It might be a vision of a possible future or something, or it might be a nightmare future, depending on who you are. But it's not really science in that sense. But the fact is, human beings sometimes are guided by things that inspiring visions of the future or things they hope will happen. And so, again, a sociologist like Marx could come back and say, well, you could call it non-scientific, but if we're going to be good sociologists, we do need to take into account human future, possible futures, because that is part of their present action sometimes. Anyway, but falsifiability is an issue that we need to keep into account. And the basic point I'm trying to make here, too, is that science really isn't about proving things are true. It's really hard to prove something is true for all time because you never know. There might be big changes or new data or things could happen and things could shift and those things won't be true. So science doesn't ever believe that what it's found out is absolutely true. What it can do is prove things wrong. You can prove a theory can't be correct because it doesn't fit the data we have. And if you can prove that a theory is false, well, then you can get rid of it or change it. And that's what science tries to do, is prove theories wrong and fix theories that have been proved wrong to try and make them better. But we're never in a position to say, we know for a fact the universe was caused by a Big Bang. I mean, all evidence may point to that. It might be the best theory that takes account of the evidence. But if new evidence comes in, like I mentioned the other day, that the universe is expanding at an accelerating rate, that doesn't fit the theory. So they have to change the theory. And a good scientist will say, I don't know what's true. I never know what's true. Truth could change tomorrow. I could wake up tomorrow and the universe could be totally different. Who knows? All I know is what is not true because it's been disproven. So that's a good scientific attitude, to never be sure of yourself. A scientist that says, I know for a fact this is true, is somebody who's not really being very scientific in their thinking. A good scientist will say, our best theories suggest this is the best way of looking at something, but they would never say, we know for a fact it's true. Anyway, So those are some logical issues. As I've said, I normally would take you through the full research process right here. And if you look at your textbook, they take you through that process. From the very beginning, and one point I would make is, the very beginning of the research process is a question you have, not a hypothesis. I think they sometimes mislead school children in elementary schools today and high schools where they say, you always begin science with a hypothesis. Well, that's, again, a wrong attitude, because you shouldn't be setting out to prove something is true. You should be setting out to find out answers to questions. And so really, science starts with a research question. You're trying to see if something's true, or trying to get more information about it. And so you're not necessarily trying to prove anything yet. And a research question, one of the first things you would do to answer a research question is review what other people already know about it. So one of the first things in the research process is to go study what's already been found out about your topic. If you want to know, for example, does intellectual curiosity lead to marijuana smoking? That was that weird question we started with. I mean, we said a study in the 70s knew that, but nowadays, would we find that? That might be an interesting question. Who does smoke pot at a college campus, and what are they getting out of it, and is it helping them or hurting them, or why? That might be a good research question, but especially now that marijuana is legal, we might want to know what problems it might cause for people. But if that's your research question, you don't just start by going out and studying it by collecting data and asking people questions and stuff. Your very first step is what's called a literature review. Find out what's already known. Go to the library, look it up, go on Google, find other studies that have already been done. And by the way, if you don't know about Google, if you're ever going to do scholarly work on Google, and some of you used Google to answer the question I gave you on the essay, there's something called Google Scholar. You can find, it's a form of Google that only gives you peer-reviewed scholarly articles. The whole key to when I say scholarly, and I say literature, scholarly literature, we mean research produced by professional researchers, by typically people at universities. We're not talking about the kind of literature books you could go find at Barnes & Noble. Most sociology that's ever done, you'll never see at a bookstore. Sometimes they have what's called pop sociology, sociology that's written for a more general audience that most of us could read. But most of the work that's done is put in journals and that you'll never see. And that would be hard even for me with a PhD in sociology, a lot of the journal articles for me to understand because they're specialized articles about a very specific topic that I might have very little knowledge of. But what makes them science is that they're peer-reviewed, that other scientists have looked at the work and decided, did this follow the research process well? Did it do all the things? Was it logical in the ways we just talked about? Did it pay attention to evidence and logic in the ways we've said? Was it rigorous in the ways we've talked about? And so that's what really separates scholarly work. And sociology has a lot of journals. Two of the main ones are like American Sociological Review and the American Journal of Sociology, but there's literally hundreds of journals out there. And every sociologist at every college and university, not two-year colleges like this one, but most four-year colleges and universities, they have to write, they have to do research. In fact, that's the main job they have, not teaching people. My main job is to teach. I don't have to do any research. But if you're at a university, your main job is to write scholarly articles, and then you teach on the side, basically. So you may find when you go from two-year school to the four-year that your professors there are a little less interested in teaching and making sure you understand, and a little more focused on research and presenting research, and it's up to you to try and understand it, not their job to make sure you have all the tools you need. So anyway, but I did want to make sure you know about Google Scholar. If you're ever trying to use the internet to find the most up-to-date scholarly research articles about a topic, Google Scholar is a really helpful thing. I wish I'd had it when I was an undergraduate, because a lot of the articles too are like full text, and you just print them out, and you've got your little your literature review accomplished. But and why would you do a literature review? You got to find out what's already known. What do we know about this question already? Because why would I do another study if there's already been 100 studies of something? The world doesn't need another study. of marijuana use among college students if there's thousands already. But if there hasn't been many on the question I'm trying to answer, then maybe we do need another one. What's left to know? What haven't they found out? And I like to think of science as a conversation. It's a conversation that's already ongoing. When you decide to enter into it with a research project, it's an ongoing conversation that's already happening. You need to go listen to that conversation first and find out, what are the other scholars saying about my research question? What don't they know yet? Because that's what I can add to the conversation. I can speak up in the conversation and tell them something they haven't talked about yet. You can also learn how to study the topic, how to study it. In other words, methods. In research, the way you study something is known as your method or your methodology. And that's what I want to turn to next. I want to make sure we have a good understanding of what are the main methods in sociological research. And again, I'm not going to take you through the whole research process. I think that's going to be a waste of time at this point. But I do want to focus on the part of the research process known as your study design. Once you've figured out what's left to know, you need to figure out, how can I study it? And the research literature may give you some ideas, like different techniques you can use, different instruments you can use. Like if you're going to do a survey of people, maybe the research literature has already developed a survey that you can use and give to a different sample of people. Or maybe they have some techniques you can use. But what you're trying to do is design a study, your own study, that's going to answer your research question, or at least answer the parts of the research question that haven't been answered yet. And so in the research process, that would be like the third step, but we'll just call it study design. And I want to make sure we understand the idea of study design. Your research question would pretty much dictate your study design. Whatever you're trying to find out has certain kinds of methods that are useful for that, and others that are not so useful. There's two main kinds of methods in sociology: quantitative methods and qualitative. They're so different from each other that most sociologists, if you ask them, will identify themselves as one or the other. There are quantitative sociologists and qualitative sociologists. Quantitative, as you probably can guess, has to do with numbers. So the type of data is one major difference between these two types of study design. Quantitative, the type of data they use and try to collect and analyze are numbers. Qualitative sociologists, you can say, mostly when they're collecting data and analyzing it, they're dealing with words. And I don't know about you, but those are sometimes feel like very different skills. Some people are really good with numbers and good at crunching numbers and good at math and really like numbers and aren't scared by numbers, don't have math anxiety. Other people may feel a lot more comfortable with words and get a lot more anxiety around numbers and feel much more comfortable reading something than trying to calculate something or crunch something. Me personally, I've always had an ease with words and reading and writing, and numbers have always been difficult for me. It kind of comes down to that in sociology. Which type of sociology you gravitate to sometimes has to do with your own mind, your own brain. If you're a numbers person, you might like this. But those aren't very good reasons, really, for choosing which method you should use. What really should dictate it is the research question. What kind of study does your research question need in order to answer it? And you shouldn't let your own personality dictate what kind of study. That wouldn't be methodologically sound. In other words, again, you're trying to do a study that other scholars are going to read and go, this was a well-done study. And if you say, well, we decided to do it this way because I just like numbers better, well, they're going to go, well, that's not good science. Now, it's true that people have different aptitudes. And so you may decide to ask research questions that allow you to focus on words because that's what you're good at. So you may want to think about your research questions and try to ask ones that allow you to use the skills you're comfortable using. But nowadays, most sociologists, I think, would say most research questions need both types at some point. There used to be a kind of bias in the field where, and there still is to some extent, where people refer to quantitative things as hard data. Numbers being somehow more convincing, more real somehow than people's words. Obviously, in a political season like now, sometimes we distrust words. When people say things, we don't always believe what they say is what they really believe or who they really are. So words sometimes are a little softer. But in some ways, that's a prejudice that got built into social science, partly because, in some ways, it has to do with gender. Men tend to gravitate to quantitative sociology, and they tend to, if you look at who are the quantitative sociologists in a typical sociology department, a lot of them are the older men in the department, and they think of their work as very important and very solid and very hard. And a lot of women are drawn to a more qualitative sociology. And so like in my field, when I was a graduate student in my department, there was this clear battle between the quantitative side and the qualitative side. And the quantitative side were the men, and the qualitative side were the women. And it was stupid. And hopefully nowadays we're seeing that there really isn't one is better than the other. The question is, what are you trying to find out, and which kind of data is called for, given that you're trying to find that out? So type of data is one difference between them, but what is the typical study design? How do you get your numbers? How do you get your words? Quantitative sociologists typically use surveys. There's other ways to get numbers from people. Facebook, I think, if I could have access to Facebook, wow, imagine the sociology you can do with Facebook. And in fact, the company Facebook does their own little sociological experiments. Like they'll do things where they make sure some people's feed gets these kinds of stories on their feed, and some people get these kinds of stories, and then they observe your behavior after you got that, and then they do little studies and see, like, if we only give you a feed with like a lot of happy stories, how do you act after that? Or if we put on your feed a bunch of negative, scary stories, how do you act after that? And they've been doing little sociological studies of people. I sometimes get frustrated as a social scientist. The rich companies like Facebook, they have a lot of data on people, a lot of numbers, sales figures, usage figures, a lot of numbers that could tell us a lot about how humans behave and why they behave. But they don't really share their numbers with the scientific community. It's commercial, it's privately owned, they use it for their own purposes. Meanwhile, in colleges and universities, there's a lot of social scientists, working on low budgets, trying to figure out why people act the way they do, and we don't always have access to the kind of data that these big companies have. But government collects data, others collect data. So surveys like the census or voting figures or all kinds of numbers are out there that if you want to get the numbers and crunch them as a social scientist, you can. But a survey is a very typical way of getting numbers. And sometimes social scientists don't just get what's called archival data, getting numbers that somebody else already collected, like the government or Facebook, but they collect their own data by going out with a survey and having people fill it out. Or nowadays, a lot of time it's online or on the phone. And so surveys, what are surveys? Well, you've probably taken some in your life. And in fact, a voting ballot is something like a survey. Surveys have forced choice. Well, first of all, they have closed-ended questions. They ask you on the survey a question that only has a single answer to it. Like, who are you going to vote for president? Is it this one, this one, this one, or that one? And you just pick one. It's also, what you can say is, it's forced choice. They give you a choice, but you're forced to pick one of their choices. Forced choice. And that has some advantages for certain kinds of purposes. But qualitative research is different. A typical study for qualitative research, or typical study design, would be interviews. What's the difference between interviewing somebody and surveying them? If you fill out a survey, like I said, it's a limited number of very short questions with just one answer, and you just pick the answer they gave you. In an interview, though, it's much more open-ended. what would be an open-ended question about the presidential election? One that doesn't necessarily just have a single answer and a forced choice set of answers. How could you ask somebody about their voting?
What qualities do you like in your candidate?
Maybe, although that's a little bit closed-ended because there's a limited number, right? So you're asking them to say them themselves. You're giving them a little more choice. You're not forcing the choice. They get to pick the qualities, but you're saying, tell me the qualities. So yours is a little open-ended, but you could imagine them listing 3 or 4 and then stopping. But how could you, again, the idea with qualitative research is I'm trying to get words from people. And the more words, the better sometimes. I mean, the more that you can get people talking, the more they're going to say, and the more they say, the more data you have. So what else, aside from qualities that somebody might look for, there's obviously other things that would guide somebody's choice of president, right? Not just the qualities they look for. So how could you get at that? Like, what would you ask somebody?
How do you feel about the voting action that takes place in America?
Yeah, just talk to me about voting. Talk to me about the presidential election. You're not saying what qualities, you're just letting them talk about it. Oh, it sucks, I hate it, or, well, why do you hate it? What's going on with that? Or tell me about the candidates. What are your thoughts on the candidates? In other words, in a qualitative interview situation, you're as much as you can, you're trying to let them decide how to talk about it, what words to use, what topics to bring up, what issues to address, because you're trying to let them you're trying to hear their voice. You can say that qualitative researchers are interested in what Max Weber, the founding father of symbolic interactionism, called Verstehen. That's a German word. That means understanding, but it means understanding the other person's perspective. Quantitative sociologists aren't so interested in your perspective as the person filling out the survey. They just need your answers to their questions so they can turn you into a number. In other words, they're not really interested in you as a whole human being. They're interested in your numerical value on a particular question. And sometimes that's all you'd be interested from a person. But sometimes, depending on what your research question is, you might really want to get their perspective on it. Not them as a number, but them as a whole human being who has doubts and hopes and ambivalence and concerns and might not know exactly where they stand or might not know exactly what qualities they want in a president. So you want to know more about, their experiences. What's it like voting? What kinds of times did you vote? How was it? What was it like? Did you like it? Did you like the candidate after you voted for them? There's all kinds of things you can talk about with somebody in an interview that isn't going to come out on a survey. Now, it's a lot of data, it's a lot of words, but it can be very rich. It's a richer, more in-depth. A survey is also a snapshot. You can think of it. You're capturing data from people at one moment in time. You're saying, fill out this survey right now in the next 5 minutes. How do you feel right now about Donald Trump? And so it's like taking a picture right now. But people are complicated people, and I don't know if you've ever felt if there was a picture taken of you. Did that picture look just like you? Haven't you ever looked at a picture and said, that looks nothing like me? But it's a picture of you. Snapshots can be deceiving in that sense. They can be a distortion because people might feel one way right now and feel totally different tomorrow or different later today. And so surveys can kind of capture how people think and feel at one moment in time. Interviews can be more in-depth in terms of getting more information over time. You can also re-interview people. You can interview them several times over the course of a study. You can also ask them about, how did you feel about Trump before the campaign? How did you feel about him at the election? How do you feel about him now that the election's over? In other words, you can get a timeline there. It's more like a video. A snapshot is just a picture at a moment in time, where an interview, you're getting people over a little period of time there. And so you're getting more depth, more information. Well, when would you want either one of these? When would you want a lot of depth? Well, another issue is scope. How big of a study can you do? if you're doing interviews with people and they're going in depth and you're spending hours talking to them over maybe multiple sessions of multiple hours of talking to them, well, that's going to be hard to have a whole lot of people. When I say scope, what we're talking about is your N. N is the number of cases in a study. Rarely can we study the whole group of people that we're trying to study. If I'm trying to study college students and their marijuana smoking, I can't study all college students and their marijuana smoking. That's millions of people. Especially if I want to go in depth and really understand, get some firsthand of their marijuana smoking, I'm not going to be able to do a whole lot of numbers of people. So qualitative studies tend to have what are called a small n. I got my PhD by writing a dissertation on military enlistment. Why do young men enlist in the military? And I only interviewed 15 guys. Just 15 people was my N. And you might say, well, what can you tell from 15 guys? Maybe those were 15 weirdos. How do you know that means anything? And you'd be right to ask those questions, because that's the problem with small n is you can't generalize. You can't say, well, what I found out from these 15 guys, I know that's true of all military enlistees. No, you can't say that. You didn't have enough people in your sample to be able to generalize. So that's what you give up by going in depth. You're giving up breadth. You're giving up how many different cases you can study in your study. Quantitative studies, by definition, have to be large n, because if you're going to count up things and crunch things statistically, you need enough cases in there to be able to do meaningful statistical analysis. As I've mentioned before in this class, surveys often have an n of like 1,500 people, whereas my little interview study had 15 people, so like a factor of 100 is how different they were.
I know it all depends on the study, but what number makes it credible?
It does depends on the study. We can talk a little bit about sampling strategy. I don't want to spend too much time on it. But the basic idea of sampling is this. You have a research population. Thank you. Coming over. The research population, that's the group you're interested in. The group your research question is about. So our research question, and we didn't specify one, but normally when I teach this, I say, let's imagine our research question is, does intellectual curiosity lead to marijuana smoking among college students? If that was our research question, then who is our research population? Well, it's all college students. That's a lot of people. That's millions of people. I can't sample them all, but I got to draw a sample. And you're asking, well, how many do I need in that sample for it to be a valid sample? And there's different questions along those lines. One is, well, how big is my research population? If my research population is only 400 people, that might still be too big for me to study all by myself, but I might only need a relatively small sample to understand those 400 people. You know, maybe 30 of them would be enough. I don't know. I'm not enough of a statistician. But if your research population is 350 million Americans, well, then 30 people is probably not going to do it. And they say 1,500. For that big of a research population, something like 1,000 to 1,500 is a very typical sample size. But the real question is, you've got to give everybody an equal chance. Everybody in your college student, in your research population, has to have an equal chance of getting into your sample. And so that's why people say, well, what you're trying to do is make your sample representative. You're trying to have it represent this larger group. I can't get all 3 million college students into my group, but I'm going to get a little sample of them, and they need to be the representatives of that 3 million. So they need to look and act like that 3 million. And so how do I ensure that? Well, you're basically saying, if I want to give everybody in here an equal chance to get in there, because if I don't, then I'm biasing my sample. Bias, a biased with an B-E-D, a biased sample is one where certain people got to be in my sample with more ease than other people. If my sample, like let's say I want to study college students, and the only people in there are male math students, well, that doesn't represent all college students, because there's a lot of people that don't take math, a lot of non-males, and all kinds of people that wouldn't fit that. And so if I somehow were giving male math students more chance than other people to get into my sample, then I'm biasing my sample towards that group, and it's not representative. So the way to make it representative is to give all people in this group an equal chance of getting into this group. And how do you do that? Well, it's essentially saying we got to make it random. You don't want to bias it by tilting your sample in favor of a certain portion of your research population. So you try to make it random. And that's, by the way, a lot of researchers got the prediction of the election wrong. They were way wrong. Most of the people saying who was going to win the election said Hillary Clinton was going to win. They said she had like a 70, 80% chance of winning. Or much more at certain points. They were saying she was like 90% chance of winning. I saw one that said she had like 110% chance of winning. That there was like less than 10% chance this guy could win. And yet he won the election. So you might say, well, what value are surveys? And if they're totally wrong in their prediction. And there's a lot of issues there. One is, it's hard to predict what people are going to do in the future. Asking people how they're going to vote 10 days from now isn't a very valid way of measuring how they're going to vote, because they may not vote that way. It's hard to predict the future. But the real issue has to do with sampling strategy. How do you make sure you give everybody in here the same chance? Well, randomizing is a good way, and one way people do that is with like phone surveys. So phone surveys, sometimes they say, well, let's just call every 10th number in the phone book. That's random, every 10th, we don't know who they are. And so if we call every 10th person in there, we'll get a sample that looks pretty much like everybody in the phone book. Well, do you see any problems? What might be the problem? Who might you bias your sample towards or against if you're taking numbers out of the phone book? People who don't have numbers listed in the phone book, who is that? A lot of people are on cell phones today with no phone book. No listed phone number. And who does that skew to? Who do you think does have their number listed in the phone book and who doesn't have it listed? Well, young people, for example, are much more likely to have a cell phone and not a landline. And, people in prison are much less likely to not have a landline. People who are poor are not likely to have a landline. Homeowners are much more likely to have a landline than people who rent. And so a few years ago, it was actually the Republicans that were very wrong. They had Republican pollsters predicting for sure Mitt Romney was going to win the election. They said, we know he's going to do it. And then he didn't. And they were like, what's wrong with our polling? And it turned out they had relied too much on phones and landlines. And if you rely on landlines, you're getting an older population. It's biased towards the old, towards the home owning, so middle class and upper middle class people, and away from young people and people involved in the criminal justice system. So the people they talked to did skew Republican, and many of them said, yeah, vote for Romney. But they didn't talk to a lot of other voters who weren't thinking that way. A similar thing happened, I think, in the current election. They had a hard time getting a representative sample. I don't know if it was relying too much on landlines. Partly another technology that affects it is call screening. So nowadays people can screen their calls, and a lot of people won't take a call if it says research firm or polling data firm or polling partners or social science partners or whatever it says on your phone. You're like, I'm not answering that. And who doesn't answer their phone? Young people, low-income people, who does? So anyway, we're not getting very representative samples when it comes to political polling right now. And the whole expert world is kind of up in arms about how we're going to get better measures. But there's another issue, too, I think, with surveys. People don't necessarily lie on surveys. Maybe I mentioned this earlier on the day of our exam. People don't necessarily lie about their past behavior. People, it turns out, on self-report studies of crime, are pretty honest on them. But people might give what's called there's something called social desirability bias. People might give the answer that seems most socially desirable. In other words, if you're being surveyed on the phone by a live person and they're asking you who are you going to vote for, you might give them the answer that sounds the best. And Trump was somebody that everyone was saying bad things about during the campaign. And all the mainstream media was saying, he's unfit to be president and he's a terrible guy. And so there was a lot of motivation for people to say, no, I'm not voting for that guy. No, I'm voting for Hillary. Yeah, I'm with her. And then when they get into the voting booth, do something different when they're in private. So I think that's a big reason why the polls were skewed, is people said one thing to a pollster and did another thing when they voted. But anyway, so surveys have some limitations. And when we say they're the hard data, that's not always the case. They're not always accurate. Again, the question is validity and reliability, and are surveys always the most valid way of getting data or the most reliable? And no, the answer is they're not. But the main difference between these two is their scope, and which is reflecting their difference in the kind of data they get. But that really then gets to the question of, well, what is the purpose, the research purpose in mind? When would you use one or the other? A big, large N study with not very in-depth data? Or when would you use a small and very in-depth study with a non-representative sample? So you can't get representative samples when they're this small. So therefore you can't know if the results you have fit any larger population. Hopefully, if you've done a good job of getting a random representative sample, you can be pretty sure, within a certain percentage of error, that the answers you got from them would extrapolate or generalize to the larger population. So then when would you use one or the other? A good purpose for using quantitative data is hypothesis testing. If you already think you have a good theory of why people do what they do, or a good theory that answers your research question, and you want to test out if your theory is right, then you're going to have to use quantitative data, because the only way to confirm whether your theory actually works is if you have generalizable data to your whole population. And a small N study isn't going to give you that. If I want to know, for example, I'll just give you an example of my own work and how these two things work together, but sometimes are at odds with each other. My interest is in young people's voting behavior, and some people are mentioning a big impact on this election was, young people, again, didn't vote in the numbers they probably should. A lot of them are registered or are able to vote, but they don't. And given what young people say on surveys about who they would have supported had they voted, the election might have come out a lot differently if a lot of 18 to 25-year-olds had voted, much more of them. So for a long time, I've been interested in why don't 18 to 25-year-olds vote like they should? It hasn't always been the case. In the 1960s, young people were very involved in the political process. So why now are so many of us, or you, not involved? Now, the quantitative data give us one answer to that question. Quantitative data. They tell us young people don't vote in the right numbers. They don't vote. But what they don't tell us is really why. In other words, quantitative data are really good for telling us what is going on. If we want to know what is going on in a group of people, then asking them short, forced choice questions on a random sample, representative sample of people, is a good way of finding out. If I want to know who you voted for, who 18 to 25-year-olds voted for, then getting a random sample of 1,500 young people and asking them who they voted for would tell me the answer, would tell me what percentage of young people voted for Trump or Hillary or Jill Stein or something like that. What they don't tell us, though, and the quantitative data, whether it comes from surveys or from the voting records itself, you can go look at the voting records itself and see who voted. And so, voted for who, that tells us what's going on. What it doesn't tell us is why. A lot of these surveys that ask young people if they voted, it just asks them, did you vote or not? And then they say, no, I didn't. And a lot of that data just tells us, no, they didn't vote. And some people thought they know why. I mean, when I was researching this question, I was part of the young people's group when I first started, and they said my generation was slackers. They said my generation was Generation X, and they're just a bunch of slackers, and they are just apathetic. They don't care about America. They're too into themselves. They're too narcissistic. That was another term that's still getting applied to young people today, that they're just too focused on themselves and their own belly buttons to worry about the country. Now, I didn't think that was true about me and my friends and other young people I knew back in the early 90s when I was a young slacker myself. But I did know that we were not as active in politics as our parents had been when they were our age. So I knew something's different here about being a young American than it was when my parents were here. But I don't think it's apathy. I don't think we're a bunch of selfish people that don't care about America. That's not how me and my friends are. Now, I was able to get a hold of a big survey that was done of college students, done of the UC system. It was called the Student Engagement in the Research University Study. And they had a big sample, 10,000 people they had. And it was an online sample because college students are all online. That, by the way, is another sampling issue. If you do an online survey, you might be biasing your sample because of something called the digital divide. Not everybody has access to a computer or is very computer literate. So if you do an online survey, you're skewing your sample towards educated, technologically savvy people with computers in their home. But if you're doing a survey of college students at the UC system, then an online survey is a very reasonable method to use because most of them do have computers and they are computer savvy and they don't mind taking a survey that way. And this survey had 10,000 people. One unique thing about this survey is it was both quantitative and qualitative. It had a lot of forced choice questions, closed-ended questions, but every once in a while on that survey, they had a very open-ended question that just said, is there anything else you'd like to say? Is there anything you'd like to tell the researchers doing this survey? And these are college students with a lot of time on their hands who, when the researcher said, anything you want to say, well, a lot of them wrote a bunch of stuff. And I'm not a quantitative researcher, so when I approached the researchers who did this study and asked them if I could have their data, I happened to know that they had a huge amount of qualitative data. They had stacks and stacks of writing by college students, and they had no one that was going to look at it. They were more interested in the quantitative stuff because their research questions were more about that. And they had kind of just put in those open-ended things just as a method of making the person feel comfortable filling out the survey. But when I said, can I see your qualitative data? They're like, sure. And they printed it out, and it came to me as a huge stack of data. And I'm sitting there looking through it. Anyway, what I started to look at was, well, there was a question on the survey that asked, did you vote or not? And a lot of the people in the UC system, students, said, no, I didn't vote. So quantitatively, they looked like a bunch of apathetic college students that weren't voting. But then I looked at the qualitative data, and a lot of the responses on there were people saying, back on question 19, you asked me if I voted. And I had to say no, because I didn't. But I want to tell you why. And they went on to a big thing of, I'm not apathetic, I'm not a slacker, I just moved here to Isla Vista in Santa Barbara, I'd never lived here before, I'm only 19 years old, I've never voted before, and I don't know who to vote for in this town, and they want me to vote locally, but I've never lived here. Wouldn't I be messing up the political process in this town if I were to vote on candidates I don't know nothing about? So they were saying, I don't want to vote just to vote, I want to take democracy seriously and vote when I know what I'm doing. So a lot of them said, I didn't vote because I'm not ready to. It's not that I don't want to vote. It's not that I don't think voting is important. It's not that I don't think the country is important. It's that I think I'm not ready yet with my knowledge and experience to be able to vote. And to me, that was a very different answer. That's a very different why than people were attributing to the numbers. So if you just look at the numbers, you don't really know why they did or didn't vote. But if you ask people in depth about their voting behavior and why they didn't vote, you may get a very different answer as to why they didn't. And I ended up calling that principled abstention, meaning you can abstain from voting. You can say, I'm not going to vote on this. And you can do that for very principled reasons, like I have a conflict of interest, like I'm going to make money off this vote, so I'm not going to vote on it. Principled abstention. And that's what a lot of these young people I thought were saying. It's not that I don't care. It's not that I'm into myself. It's that I care so much that I don't want to make a bad vote.
Something I wanted to ask about, and wasn't sure where it would fit. It was the weird mixtures I've seen of surveys that are like in between qualitative and quantitative.
Okay.
Like you were kind of bringing up already. Well, they'll take like a survey of like, not a survey. They'll do like interviews like 30 or 40 people that are qualitative, and they'll take like their responses or their stories, and then have people select and be like, which ones generally applies to you? Or something.
Oh, that's an interesting method. So that's a way of trying to make quantitative data a little more in depth. Instead of just who did you vote for, which of these reasons for why you might vote for somebody applies most to you. And yeah, I would say that's a more advanced technique. Like I've said before, these have been seen as separate things to the point where you could even have divisions in whole sociology departments between the quantitative and the qualitative people. But I would say nowadays, more and more social scientists are saying, you need both. It depends on your research question. And you can sometimes bring those two things together. This is telling what's going on, like who people voted for. It could tell us which types of people, like white men with college education voted more for Trump than white women with college education. But it doesn't tell us why. But if you were to ask a few people why in a qualitative, in-depth survey, then get some answers, then you can go back and put those same answers to the quantitative. And that's where I was just headed here, actually. So the quantitative data didn't tell us what was going on, but the qualitative told us what was going on, but not why. So this is better for telling us why people do what they do, what your textbook calls it the causal mechanism. Like if we find out that X, white, college educated, is correlated with Y, voting for Trump, well, you could say being white and college educated caused men to vote for Trump. That's what the quantitative data say. But it doesn't tell us why. Why did they? And to get at that, we would need more in-depth answers from guys like that. Well, what was on your mind? What were you thinking about? What were you concerned about? Why did you vote for him? Did you always know you were going to vote for him? And so you can get much more in-depth information. Causal mechanism meaning what was the thing that triggered their vote for that guy? And how is that different from the triggers for other people? But once you get a few answers like that, a very common qualitative technique, I didn't bring it up. Interviews are the general way. A lot of times they're just one-on-one, but there's also something called focus groups. And a focus group is like a group interview where you get a group of people together and you talk to them at length and in depth about their behavior. And that's a neat method because then people talk to each other too, and that can help stimulate conversation so we get even more words for us to analyze. And sometimes if you just interview somebody, they're not sure why they did what they did, but once they talking to other people, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, that jogs my thinking. Yeah, I know what you're saying. Yeah, that was why I did it. So if they did a focus group with 30 voters or something, and a few answers came up about why people voted, why they voted, well, again, we face the generalizability question. Did that focus group, those 15 people or 5 people, do they represent anybody? Well, we don't know. What that can do is generate a hypothesis. We can come up with some ideas about why people do what they do. Like from a focus group, we could come up with 5 typical reasons why people said they voted for Trump. But we don't know if they're actually typical. They were just typical of the people we talked to in our small-scale study. So now we need to test that hypothesis. And could we find out if that generalizes to white men in general? If we had 5 reasons why white men voted for him, and then we did a survey and said, here's 5 reasons why people vote for Trump. Which one fits you? Then your forced choice questions are more informed by your in-depth qualitative study. And so you can see how you need both. To have good questions on a survey, you have to have a good understanding of people's in-depth feelings and thoughts and experiences. And if you just try to get at people's behavior without knowing their internal life, you might not have good questions. The forced choices you give them might not see themselves in those answers. Like, you're giving me choices, but none of them fit me very well, so I'll just pick the one that I guess is closest, but that's not very valid data. If people are just choosing what kind of fits, but isn't really themselves, well, then the survey is distorting them. But we can get better surveys if we do better qualitative work. So what I'm trying to say is both methods go hand in hand. sometimes we don't know very much about a group of people. If we don't know very much about college students and their pot smoking, then we're not ready to test any hypotheses about it. We don't know about it. We don't know why they do it or what they're doing when they do it or how it affects their life. If we don't know any of those things, then we might want to do a small-scale interview study, talk to a few college students about their pot smoking. We might want to do a focus group, get a group of college students in a room talking about pot at their campus. We might even want to do what's called an ethnography. An ethnography is when you actually go live amongst a group of people and try to understand what their life is like. There have been some really cool qualitative studies where sociologists enrolled in a high school. You have to have a very young look on your face if you're a sociologist, but some young sociologists have enrolled in a high school, and that was their study, studying high school students, not telling anybody that they were there studying. There's some ethical problems with that, but there's other kind. One of my favorite sociological studies was by Barbara Ehrenreich, where she's a wealthy sociologist, upper middle class sociologist, but she wanted to know what's it like to be a minimum wage worker in America. Is it possible to live on minimum wage? So she went and moved to Florida, changed her name, changed her resume, and started pretending she wanted to work as a waitress. And she got work as a waitress, and she tried to find an apartment and pay for that, and she tried to live for a year on basically minimum wage, and she found after a year she couldn't do it. And she wrote a whole book called Nickel and Dime about how difficult it is for low-income people in the United States. So that was an ethnography. She immersed herself. I got to go on a tour with a rock band. That was an ethnography where I'm just sort of living their life and seeing what their life was like and interviewing them, yes, but also observing passively and taking pictures and other ways of collecting data about their life. But again, that's a small study, one band, or one person being low income in Florida. So we can generate hypotheses that way, come up with ideas about why rock bands are the way they are or why being low income is difficult, but we can't prove anything with such small samples. So you take those hypotheses and you turn them into a new study design like a survey or some kind of more quantitative data, and you can test your hypothesis. Is it really true that a lot of people who don't vote because they're abstaining rather than just not caring? And so you could put that on a survey instead of just having a question, did you vote or not? You could have another question, say, here's some common reasons young people say they don't vote. You don't feel ready yet, but you plan to vote later. That would be one of the answers. And if a lot of people pick that, a statistically significant number picked it, you could say, well, we confirmed our hypothesis that is a common reason why young people don't vote. But again, you can't tell that from the qualitative data. If we already know a lot about a group and a lot about our research question, and we've already done a lot of in-depth work, and now we have some good hypotheses to test, then that's when you would want to use more of a survey type of design to find out if what you think is true about them is in fact true of a random representative number of them. So with college students, let's just think this through. Let's say we did want to study young people's pot smoking behavior, and we want to measure how intellectually curious they are. Well, there's ways to measure intellectual curiosity. They're called personality scales, and you could measure people's motivation for learning. Like, do you learn mainly so you can make money later, or do you like learning just to learn things? Those kinds of questions. Or do you ever read the books the professor recommends but doesn't require, or do you only read the required books? And these would be the kinds of survey questions you could ask that, depending on the choices people picked, you could categorize that person as either being intellectually curious or not intellectually curious. And then you can ask survey questions asking them, do you smoke pot or not? And then you can correlate. You can say, well, are the people who scored high as being intellectually curious, are they more likely, quantitatively, than other people to smoke pot? If they're more likely in a statistically significant way, and I'm not going to get into statistics here, but if in other words they're more likely than the other people to smoke pot, and by a significant number, then you would say, well, that hypothesis was confirmed. But anyway, let's say you wanted to do a survey. In other words, what I'm trying to say is depending on your research question, you'd have to decide which study design. And if your research question is, do intellectually curious students smoke pot more than other students? Well, that's a what question. What's going on? And to find that out, I'd have to survey a large number of people. On the other hand, if I want to know what is it about being intellectually curious that makes people want to smoke pot, if I want to know why they do it, I might have to do a more in-depth kind of qualitative study. Maybe I need to interview some college pot smokers, or maybe go enroll in a college like Chico State for a while and see what the behavior is of the students there and who smokes and who doesn't. Or maybe I need to do some other kind of qualitative study. But anyway, that's what dictates your study design is, what am I trying to find out? What's my research purpose? And which type of method would be appropriate? And ultimately, like you're saying and I'm saying, in the end, research questions usually end up having multiple studies devoted to them, and they're usually a mix. You start out with qualitative to get a sense of what's out there and who's doing what. But you also look at some already existing quantitative data to get a sense of who's doing what. And you kind of move back and forth. It's called triangulation is the term nowadays that a lot of research are using. Triangulation comes from the world of navigation, boat navigation in the old days before compasses. If you want to navigate your boat, you had to use stars, and you had to figure out the distance between the stars and figure out the hypotenuse and all that stuff and figure out the direction of your boat. It's a triangle. Well, in the same way, we can take qualitative data on why people do what they do in small numbers of people and quantitative data on large numbers. And by kind of bringing the two together, asking those why questions, asking the what they're doing, generating hypotheses, testing hypotheses, eventually we'll arrive at some good, valid knowledge about what's going on with our research question. And so what I'm trying to say is both types of method, quantitative and qualitative, are absolutely essential. They're like different stages of the research process. At the beginning of a topic, we need in-depth studies to kind of get the lay of the land. As we get to know more of the topic and have ideas and theories about what's going on, we need to test those theories on quantitative data. When our theories don't get proven right, then we may need to go back to the qualitative side and try to get a more in-depth understanding and generate new hypotheses. So it's like different moments in the research process. There's three basic stages of the research process, and I'm not going to go through all of them here, but the research itself, conducting the research, is another stage in the research process. And there's basically three stages. There's data collection, data processing, and data analysis. And these three steps look differently depending on if you're doing quantitative or doing qualitative. Data collection for quantitative means administering your survey, or in some cases it means just going and getting data that already exists. A lot of surveys are already done, and a lot of quantitative researchers can simply go get access to the data that somebody else collected. Or sometimes the data is archival, meaning it didn't come from a survey, but it came from some other numbers collection thing, like sales figures from a car industry, or Facebook figures from the social media site, those kinds of figures. But we're saying administering the survey would be the step. And there's some steps involved there that I'm not going to waste time on. But we talked about sampling, and that's a part of it. You have to decide, who am I going to give the survey to? You also have to design your survey. We didn't talk about that, but question design is a big part of it. How you ask a question has a big impact on the answers people give. You can really change the results of a study by simply changing the wording of a question. For example, we talked earlier in this class about, do Americans support affirmative action? And we talked about how a lot of Americans today don't support affirmative action. If you ask people, should the government hire a certain number of non-white people in all the jobs and education institutions? In other words, should there be quotas for certain racial groups? A lot of Americans will say, no, there shouldn't. I'm totally against quotas. If, on the other hand, you say, should America take positive steps to make sure groups that were historically discriminated against get the same opportunities as other people today? Most Americans will say, yeah, I'm totally for that. So it depends on how you ask it, but you can ask questions that make Americans sound like they love affirmative action, or you can ask questions that make Americans look like they hate it. So it depends on exactly how you ask the question. But that's a whole art in itself, and I sometimes get mad that a lot of people are doing surveys now because they have like SurveyMonkey and other free ways of developing surveys and making people take your survey. But if you've never studied survey question design, which I did in grad school, then you might not know what mistakes to avoid or how you're biasing your results and messing things up with your question design. For example, one common mistake is questions shouldn't be double-barreled. You should only ask about one single thing on a question. You shouldn't say, which qualities do you like in a president and why, or something like that. You're asking two different things there.
I had a question. You guys were talking about surveys that either give you like one or two answers. There are also surveys that say stuff like strongly agree, indifferent, disagree, strongly disagree. How does that?
That's called a Likert scale, and yeah, I mean, that's again goes to question design. What's the best way to get the right answers from people? And allowing people to say how strongly they agree with something is one way to get a more precise response. But again, it's a forced choice. You have to pick one of the ones they gave you. And I don't know if you've ever, when you felt those things out, I'm like, they're not saying, they say very strongly or strongly. Well, I'm like, sort of strongly. And they don't have that one, you know. So there's like, sometimes you feel like the survey is not letting you be you. And that's the point I'm trying to make here is qualitative data allows the person to say more in their own words how they feel about a topic. Whereas surveys have to give you a set of choices to pick from. And that Likert scale is one way of doing things, but that only works for certain kinds of questions, right? But if you were asking, you know, why did you vote for Trump? Just asking, like, how strongly do you like Trump, that doesn't tell us much. But if we want to know, was it because you were worried about the economy, or was it because you were worried about, you know, NAFTA or something like that, or you were worried about black people, or whatever it was, you know. So that's a whole nother topic, is just the question design. But then there's also your sampling strategy. How do I make sure I'm giving how many surveys do I need? Who should I give them to? And one question I like to ask is, let's say we were trying to get a random representative sample of Yuba College students. If our research population is Yuba College students, well, that's an N of, I think, about 6,000 total full-time students here at Yuba College. That's a lot of people to survey. You don't need to survey that many people. It costs a lot. Surveys might cost you like $10 a piece. So unless you've got, 60 grand, you know, don't do that survey. But you don't need to, because you can get a sample. But how would you get a good representative sample of Yuba College students?
People from different backgrounds.
And how would you get that? So I'm trying to think here, nuts and bolts ways. What if I just go out into the middle of out in front of the library here and say, I got survey, come fill out my survey. I'm giving away $10 gift certificate to Amazon, come fill out my survey. That's why surveys cost money, because sometimes you have to pay people, plus you got to print them out, plus you got to spend time analyzing them. So they can be expensive. But why would standing out in front of the library maybe not be the best way to get a random representative sample?
It's your biased sample still. You're running into people, because then you're only surveying the people that would be willing to come up to a random stranger and fill out a piece of paper, and then trust that it's not going to be used for something weird.
Not all students use the library.
Well, exactly. So the question we're asking is, remember, for sampling, you want to give everybody in this group an equal chance to get into that group. And if you're standing out in front of the library, you're not giving everybody an equal chance. You're giving a biased chance to gregarious people, people that want to come up and talk to you. You're sending shy people away from you. They saw you in the quad and they walked the other way. They're not going to come fill out your survey. There's people who never go to the library. There's people who take all their classes online. A lot of them are working people. As we just found out, a lot of people sitting in here, you guys don't work. So if we were just surveying people on campus in the middle of the day on a Wednesday, we wouldn't be getting working students. We wouldn't be getting older students. So again, you want to think about all the people you'd be systematically biasing your survey against. I'm just going to suggest here as our last point, the best strategy I can think of for getting a good sample of college students, UBA college students, would be giving the surveys to professors, a random sample of professors, so that you had online professors, you had professors from different subjects, that it wasn't all math, or wasn't all art students, wasn't all social science students. And that would also help with your response rate. Another big problem for surveys is most people don't fill them out. If you mail them home, most people don't fill them out. If you call people on the phone, most people don't answer it. They screen it. And so the response rate's a real problem. But I think if you gave the survey to professors who handed it out in their classes, you would get a random sample and you would get a very good response rate because people would want to fill it out because their professor was asking them to do that. So anyway, that's the answer to that question. All right, we're going to have to leave the research process behind as an abstract matter and start talking about families next week. But we're going to be looking at research on families, and so we'll learn a little bit more about how sociologists do their research, but we'll also learn more about what they're finding out about families today. And that'll be a good introduction to Thanksgiving, I think, which also involves the family. Okay, see you next week.